This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2018 annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies here at the University of California at Berkeley. My guest today is a professor of Israeli literature and culture at the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. She is the author of a new book entitled Warriors, Witches, Whores, Women in Israeli Cinema. It was published in 2017 by Wayne State University Press. Dr. Rachel Harris, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with a general question before we get to women and Israel separately, of course, but it's about the theory of the study of cinema. Do you see the study of cinema as a way to get a glimpse into a specific moment in time in which the specific films were made? You know, they say about newspapers that they are the first rough draft of history. Do you see cinema as a dramatized draft of history?
I think that cinema is a really interesting way to capture people's perception of their role in society in a given moment in time. It may not necessarily be characteristic of history, but it's definitely how people think about their history in that moment and what they think is really important for them as individuals to be able to represent out to the world. And that's even more true for Israeli cinema, where particularly in its early years, it was so entwined with the nationalist discourse. Israeli filmmakers saw themselves as pioneers, and just as pioneers were working in fields or building Tel Aviv, the pioneers of the film industry actually imagined themselves as pioneers in the same sense. And they often weren't paid for their labor. They saw it as a community project. And there was definitely this sense of doing something very important for the nation.
So because the Israeli society was so ideological, so was cinema? Is there like a direct correlation?
So there is, but not in the ways that you would expect. Very few of the early films actually represent war. There are a lot of early films that talk about nation building, particularly coming out of a cinematic history that was about pioneering. So the first Israeli films were really documentaries that were made about the Yishuv and the development of the Yishuv. And the first feature films often built storyline around cinematic footage that had already been filmed for documentary purposes. But the Israeli film industry after the Second World War doesn't really kick off until 1949. And it has almost no resources. There are no sound stages. There's no equipment. And there's really very limited potential to what people can do. And it isn't until Margot Klausner comes along and she builds the first studios,
woman as it happens,
builds the first studios in Herzliya, that we really begin to see a sense that this is a real industry. It's not just a couple of guys running around with a camera and a microphone. And then quickly afterwards, Geva Studios gets built in Tel Aviv. And these are really the central points for building what will become the Israeli film industry. But Margot Klausner is pretty clear. She writes in a memoir that she writes in the 70s, after 25 years of being the president of the Herzliya Studios, that from the beginning she imagined this as an ideological project and that it would be important to represent whatever Israel was doing out into the world. And she thought that cinema was the best medium to do that because it was so widely popular.
Is Margot Klausner the Golda Meir of cinema in the way that, you know, they said about Golda that she was the only real man in the cabinet? Can you say the same thing about Margot Klausner, that the fact that she was a woman actually highlighted the masculinity of the industry at the time?
So actually, the industry was really much more complex than we talk about it now. And it's really only through the work of a lot of young women who've been making documentaries and who have been investigating archives that we're starting to unearth the history of all of these women. The women at Geva Studios unearthed this history. what we learn is that at Geva Studios, almost all of the editors were women, and many of the women edited. They had these incredibly prestigious roles where they were responsible really for editing all of the films. And editing is a profession that a lot of women went into because you're alone in a room, you're not on a set schedule in the way that you are on a set. And so you can make your own hours. So it was a very flexible schedule to have if you also had a family. It allowed artistic creativity. It also had an immense amount of power, so that there were definitely women in the film industry. We just sort of wrote them out as we began to write film history. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is a lot of women scholars are really writing those women back into our history.
But also your take it's an avowedly feminist critique of the history of Israeli cinema. You say that at several points in the book. And as such, of course, it's not enough to say, having women in the industry is not enough to make it into a feminine or feminist industry.
Indeed. So I think that there were places in which women had actual power as women to do things, but the places where they didn't have power on the film sets, really until the last decade, has been a really significant aspect of how the film industry in Israel has been shaped. It wasn't just that women weren't the directors and weren't the producers and weren't writing the scripts. It was that the content of the stories that were told positioned women in these marginal roles because what was considered a worthy film was a film in which a man did something heroic or anti-heroic, but that the men really held the entire idea of what the film industry was. And so the problem with the film industry's lack of feminine awareness isn't just about women working in the industry, but what the stories were that were being told, how the women were being represented on screen, right? We can think of decades of Israeli movies where the representation of women either had them in these bustling maternal roles or were about showing their boobs.
I'd like to ask you now about your methodological choice to focus on women and the feminine moment in the history of Israeli cinema, where they started opening up to say, I don't know if it's more feminine representations of women, if that makes any sense, in the last 2 or 3 decades. And of course, it comes at a time where the Israeli discourse, and not just the Israeli discourse, but the Western discourse in general, starts opening up, becoming less masculine, less white, less monolithic. And in Israel, you see similar trends with opening up to the Mizrahi discourse, a more ethnic discourse, and more inclusive of non-Jewish and non-Zionist narratives. How do you place the feminist discourse in this matrix, and why did you choose to focus on it specifically and not tell a more broader story of the opening up of Israeli cinema?
So when I first started writing this book, it came about really by accident. I was trying to put together a course for my students. And so I was watching a lot of Israeli films to work out which ones I was going to select for classes. And as I'm watching the films, I'm looking up materials that I can read so that I know what assignments I can give my students. And what I found was that there was just nothing written about any of the films with women in them. And so the first paper that I gave at a conference was about the films that represented women in conflict films, Syrian Bride, Free Zone, and Lemon Tree, because I was beginning to think about how this represented a shift in time. Now, this is around 2011, 2012, and these films were fairly new. And at that moment, there had been a number of films made by women directors or that focused on themes in which women played a central role. And so as I began to write the book, I thought, well, here is a fairly small, sudden thing that is happening. It's a significant shift, but who knows where it's going to go. And then in 2014, in the middle of my writing of the book, suddenly the number of women filmmakers exploded. The number of films that came out that year by leading female directors that topped the charts of cinematic figures, that won the Ophir Awards, that won numbers at the box office, were just incredible and would have been unthinkable even 3 or 4 years earlier. And so the book actually came about right in the middle of the major shift that we've seen in filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. It's really not just confined to Israel. And as we said earlier, the fact that Israel is an ideological society was reflected in the cinema, and you can trace that development to similar ideological developments in the Israeli discourse. But we see similar trends in less ideological society as well. Actually, America is equally ideological in many ways if you look at it at the latter half of the 20th century, the Cold War, etc. But how do you place Israel in the broader context of cinema in the Western world? And there is some sort of of temporal parallels here, right? A similar development in Israel and elsewhere along the time, no?
So I think that there's a couple of different things that are going on that are really significant. And it's interesting also that you see Israel's film industry in parallel to the American film industry. While it has many of the same contours to the shape of development, it's really 30 years out of sync time-wise. And it actually bears a lot more relation to the development of feminism in Middle Eastern film industries, in Turkey, in North Africa, in Iran, and the ways in which women filmmakers have begun to push against traditional systems in which they had been excluded, partly as the result of actually changing attitudes towards feminism in those cultures. What we see as a difference, however, is that the values of women in Israeli films are much more closely aligned with the West, whereas in Middle Eastern cinema, the values end up having a much greater tension with the success of women. So in a Western feminist film, the ultimate goal is to have everything, to have the family or to have whatever choices a woman wants to make and to have the career. Whereas we do see in Middle Eastern cinema that women are still having to choose between having the successful career but being on their own or having the children and the family. And that's really a significant difference.
So maybe the issue here is not so much the content or the ideology, but the relationship between the representation of women in cinema and their participation in the industry. There are two themes that are in your book, and how do you see the connection between them? Because what I said about women also in America coming to the fore only recently, I just looked it up before this interview, that the first woman to win the Academy Awards for Best Director was Catherine Bigelow in 2010, right? That was 40 years after the first feminist wave. How do you see the relationship between the participation of women in the industry and the representation on the screen?
So I think that the Israeli film industry has really compressed the kinds of developments we've seen over 40 years in the American industry into a decade and a half. And that's why it's a much tighter but more interesting case study as well, because it's much more accelerated in the process in which this has taken place. We don't really see the first avowedly feminist Israeli film until 1992 with Tel Aviv Stories, which really functions as a major watershed. It's the first time we have a film where and this film, for those who don't know it, is 3 short stories that are brought together, and each of the short stories has a woman protagonist with female friends telling a story about women's empowerment. And it's really the first time that we see women on the screen from different social classes with different professional identities and really representing the gamut of the ethnic identities in Israel as well. We see Mizrahi figures, we see policewomen, veterinarians, we see actresses. We really get a sense that women can be everything and that in the end, the only person that can save a woman is a woman. Mm-hmm. And that's a major shift in everything that we've had up to that point. Previously, what we've seen is that women have to be rescued. And whoever they're being rescued by is really what the film is about. So are the Mizrahi men oppressing the women and the women need to be rescued by the Ashkenazi men? Are they religious women and therefore they need to be rescued by secular men? Are they Arab women and they need to be rescued by Israeli or Jewish men? And so this is the first time where we actually see that women can be rescued by women, and that is such an enormous shift in our entire understanding of the roles that women can play on screen.
And I'm trying to understand where this watershed moment emerged from all of a sudden.
So this shift really happens at a moment when a number of things have coalesced in the Israeli film industry. We've just had Yes and Hot. We've added a new TV station. So actually we have a need for greater content. By the end of the decade, we're also going to get major developments in film production. So the quality of Israeli films go up. We're also going to get to a point where we start to see greater awareness within the film industry itself of the need to represent different kinds of voices. But it's also just really good stories starting to get told. I think there's also something else that happens. After 2004, when we have Or come out, and we see that women directors are also starting to get capital inside the industry itself. We get the creation of the Women's Forum for Television and Filmmaking. And they become a network who really advocate for the situation of women. And this becomes an incredibly important moment in the Israeli film industry because it sets out what the objectives are, because the women are starting to speak to each other. And the things that they become aware of are that women's projects aren't getting funded because there are no women sitting on the lecturing. The lectors, who are the body of people who decide what films get funded, are all males. So they start to advocate at the film funds to ask that women also be part of these groups that are making the decisions. There are no female film critics. So the films are getting judged by men who are judging it by male standards or what they find interesting. So they start to advocate that women film critics will be included in the rankings. And they create a website called Mevakrot, Female Film Critics, where they not only review films that are by women or about women, but they also rank them on the Bechdel scale, which is a fairly blunt tool, but it's a very simple way of saying, the Bechdel scale has 3 components. Are there 2 or more women in the film? Do they have a name? Do they talk to each other about something other than a man? I mean, it's the most simple criteria to say, do the women exist in the film in a way that is empowering, that sees them as subjects and not just objects that we look at? Are they telling us part of us? Are they responsible for telling us the story? And yes, it doesn't account for every scenario. It doesn't account for a scenario where a woman is the only figure in the film fighting against male oppression. But at least that scale really helps us think about what kinds of things are absent in so many of Israel's films. Another of the things that begins to happen is that they become aware of the sexual harassment going on in the film industry. Israel ends up with its own Me Too moment that really precedes the American Me Too moment by a year or two, with the public trial by journalism of a major Israeli film star, as stories start to leak out about how he's been treating women on set, and it ultimately led to charges brought against him. And so some of those collaborative moments become very important in the future directions of the industry. What we see, for example, is that when women lead film projects, a much greater percentage of the people who will be on that film project will also be women. And one of the things that the women directors that I've spoken to said was that when they first started out, they didn't know how to find a female cameraman or a female grip or a female lighting, expert. And that these networks allowed the women to get in touch with one another so that they could also help women succeed within the industry. And one of the things that they all talked about was how militaristic the film industry has been, that men know each other from their military units, and that's who they're hiring onto sets, that sets have a kind of militaristic culture because they are like doing an exercise. So you're together for a period of time. There's a lot of barking, a lot of swearing on set, a lot of yelling orders at people. And the women film directors talk about how they change set culture. So one of the things they do is, instead of yelling at everybody to do things, they talk very quietly. And that has changed some of the dynamics that they encounter on set. We also see structural inequalities in wages. So the kinds of professions that women have traditionally occupied, like makeup artists, are always paid significantly less than the kind of occupations that men are traditionally occupying, like grip. And that those changes, advocating for changes in some of those things, have been really important.
I wonder to what extent this is a result of material changes, that the industry is a lot wealthier than it used to be. There are many more paid positions, and therefore, by virtue of just growing in terms of numbers, there are more people hired in the industry. Therefore, there's more place for women to join the industry and gradually occupy more and more senior positions within it?
That sounds great, but the reality is that men's films still get funded at a much greater percentage than women's films do. When you look at the statistics for 2014, a film by Eran Riklis could get 15 million shekels to be made, whereas the women's film that did incredibly well at the box office that year, Zero Motivation, was made on 350,000. And so those kinds of numbers really indicate that men are still driving the industry. At the same time, the Eran Riklis film that year, Borrowed Identity, an adaptation of Saeed Kashua novel, was ranked, I think, 9th or 10th that year, whereas Zero Motivation came 3rd.
But they are sowing the seeds now. So the director of Zero Motivation will be able to get more funding next time round, as opposed to Eran Riklis, whose shares are, I wouldn't say on the decline, but perhaps have been pretty steady for, I don't know how many decades that he's been an active director.
So I think that what we really do begin to see is that women in the film industry are gaining prominence, but they're not getting their films funded in the same way that men directors are in general. Ronnie Alkabetz was an exception, but she'd been in the film industry for 25 or 30 years before she was really able to make the kind of film that Get ended up being, which was both a financial success and an artistic success. And it was her last movie, which is a terrible tragedy for the film industry. But if you look at the critic reviews of the first film in that trilogy, To Take a Wife, they're brutal. They accuse her of screaming like a banshee. And it really takes a huge amount of time for the audience to come to see her as a major figure and an important figure in representing this character who is both Mizrahi and traditionally observant and a woman, and that her particular situation is a result of all three of those things coming together.
Do you see the participation of women as a sine qua non in this progression of more feminist content in Israeli cinema? Can a movie be like more feminist oriented when made by a man, written by a man, played by men? Or is it really, I mean, does it really have to have a strong female component to be more feminine?
I think it does have to have a strong female component to be a more feminist film, but that component doesn't necessarily have to be a female director. Malko Carmel made an incredibly beautiful film, My Lovely Sister, Ahuti Hayafa. And it's a stunning film that really looks at the relationship between two sisters inside a Mizrahi beachside town and the conflict that arises in the family. And it's one of the most sensitive portrayals of women's representation. And I think that there is really a need just to tell more stories. Right? We can never have too many stories. We can never have too many kinds of narrative. And we've had decades of stories about soldiers, and we don't feel like there should never be another war film. We continue to make those films. So, of course, you know, if women haven't been making 60 years of films, just think of the number of stories that are out there still to be told.
It's funny because before I started reading your book, I thought that a book about women in Israeli cinema would be a bit like a great Jewish sports legends, an Airplane. You remember that scene that she hands over a leaflet? And the fact that it's not just a leaflet, but actually a full-fledged book is good news in a way, isn't it?
Right, I think it is good news. And I think that we've really seen a lot of transformations, not just in the kind of mainstream Zionist narratives that we would expect. What is it like for women on the kibbutz? What is it like for women in Tel Aviv? What is it like for women in development towns? But we've also seen the rise of religious women's filmmaking, which has just opened an entire new area that we really hadn't seen in, before the last 10 years, where we're seeing these interesting and diverse portraits of women inside a community which has all kinds of different strands to it and all kinds of different narrative encounters. And that's been fascinating. We're also seeing the rise of Palestinian women filmmakers. We really get the first Palestinian feature film in 2007. That's incredibly late by film standards. And in the past few years, we're talking about 10 or 11 different feature film directors. And some of them have come out, like Suha Araf was a script writer for Iran Riklis's films. And, she came into her own. Hiyam Abbas was an actress who came into her own also as a filmmaker. And it didn't stop her also being an actress. She's doing more than one thing. And I think that's been a really significant thing that we're also seeing, that there are these new areas in which women's filmmaking is opening up. And it's not just narrative, it's also documentary films. We're seeing all kinds of political protest against social structures, protests against patriarchal systems in these women's films, whether they're religious, Orthodox Jewish women or Arab women, Muslim women, Christian women. And I think that can only enrich our understanding of film more broadly.
To what extent do you see similar progression of LGBT cinema in Israel? Are they two branches of the same struggle?
So LGBT cinema really has been gay cinema, in that it historically hasn't included women and hasn't included lesbian filmmaking. And there is a lesbian film festival every year, which has been an opportunity to see lesbian films. And there have been a number of Israeli lesbian short films that have been screened at this festival. But really the major feature film was Joe and Belle. And so we don't really see the same kind of expansion in lesbian filmmaking that we saw in gay filmmaking, which really began in the beginning of the 90s. And even, there's some sort of more underground stuff from the late 80s. And I think that there are some really interesting things behind that, because we can talk about the fact that the men who made, particularly Eitan Fox, really represented the masculine and hyper-masculine aspects of Israeli society, and therefore ultimately played into the very film industry structures that were keeping women out. And Eitan Fox makes Shirata Sirena, which, when he makes it, is one of the most important feminist tomes of the period. It really changed for women their understanding of what it meant to be a woman and to be an empowered feminist in 1990s Tel Aviv, and it was a call to arms for women. But when he makes it, what we see is that it becomes a sort of conventional love story that really removes many of the feminist aspects of the original novel that had made it such a powerful text. We see Talila without the kinds of female friends and support structures that made her such a feminist icon in the novel. And what we get is a lot of gay characters who are coded. Now, here we are with a distance of almost 20 years. No, more than 25 years, God. And with a distance of 25 years from the original film, which was made in 1994. And what we see in the film is we can all read the gay-coded characters, which we couldn't in the period, right? We all have greater literacy. But what we're left with is a completely disempowered female character. And so
Eitan Fox is just a male director who happens to be gay. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that it took him a long time to represent women differently. And if you see something like Cupcakes, Banot, which is an incredibly sweet film, in it he has a couple who are lesbians. And that's really the first time we see a prominent display of lesbians in a major feature film as just part of the background. And it's something that we don't see really before the mid-2010s. And so, yeah, I think that gay cinema is an incredibly important thing in its own right, but it doesn't advance the situation of women and hasn't done historically.
All right, Dr. Rachel Harris, the author of Warriors, Witches, Whores, Women in Israeli Cinema. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalom and Julia Brahms, our producers. And now we've got a small request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one. Check out our archive. It has more than 450 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. The Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel is the name of our page, and you can follow me and Dalia, my co-host, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.